Animal Farm Part 2, Part 21, May 12th, 2022, Africa. Cameroon, Africa. This is a special soul story that is not recommended to be repeated by others. These stories typically end in a woman being sold into the sex trade. In 2017, Crystal Dawn met a friend online. They were both members of a Facebook taxidermy group. She thought his name was Tony for years, literally years, being unaware in Africa they write their last name first and their first name last. In the beginning, Crystal loved the idea of having a friend in Africa. He was born exactly 6 months after her. He sent photos at first, but they were always of poor quality. The name he used at the time on the first account was Vamulki. It didn't mean anything to Crystal Dawn until years later when she found out who Vamulki was. And it was quite fitting that Paul had been working for Vamulki's release. Amadou Vamulki was a Cameroonian journalist that was being held in prison for years. Even the UN had asked for his release. He was a good man that was fighting for people's rights. At that time, Crystal was in a relationship with a movie star, world champion, and was in the process of taking apart her business to relocate to Alberta. Paul was a perfect gentleman that never crossed the flirtation line and treated Crystal as an actual person. They remained friends, talking occasionally for years. Crystal had moved to Alberta in March and returned to British Columbia in May. By late summer, their friendship had grown into an online romance. Online relationships are quite common these days. They offer the opportunity to meet people more similar to yourself without the restrictions of local availability. The more diverse people are, the more difficult it is to find similarities. Although, when matched with an opposite with similar goals, these two individuals have the power to support one another to no end. This perfect matching of opposites is challenging, as the two are each other's strengths where they are weak, but also the proof of why they need to try to positively influence their partner. Men and women have had biological differences that gave each their own superpowers. These are heightened abilities of nature, typically being women could be more empathetic, healing, and offer an emotional way of thinking, while men could offer physical security and a more logic-based way of thinking. When these two influence each other, they offer an insight into a heightened, more diverse being or character. Both men and women carried the ability to be both emotional and physical in all their activities, but needed each other to grow. This is where human connectedness is important. Without it, we are merely surviving alone in nature, interacting with God's creations. Even God himself sought companionship in heaven. Crystal Dawn pondered what made a person a good person. There were a variety of responses from people. Oh yeah, I'm on the right page. There were a variety of responses from people. Crystal believed it was in how we treat each other as people. It was helping others, being kind, saying encouraging things, or even just being a listening ear and showing interest in the person and their story. But what would happen if you relocated that person to the middle of the forest? There are no other people around. Then what would make them a good person? She imagined that person who lived in harmony with nature would be a good person. The bad person would be perceived as the one that was destroying the forest, so the other animals lost their homes and food. If she could be a good person in the forest, then she would create a small space for herself, no bigger than necessary, and spend her days caring for the animals and plants. She would try to create small homes in the dead branches with fluffy grasses. Perhaps she would remove the bark from a decayed tree so the birds could access the bugs beneath its tough exterior. There wasn't too much that could be done to help that did not hinder the life of another living species. Just walking upon the forest floor, she was killing the moss and fungi itself trying to grow upon it. One did not realize the life under their feet until one lies on the ground and stares at its beauty and wonder. Moss was an entire miniature ecosystem that looked like an alien planet you would see in a movie. Sometimes Crystal would find an ant struggling alone to move a giant seed. She would search the ground for another ant to join in the efforts of moving the seed. It didn't always work trying to get random ants to work together, but sometimes it did. Those were the moments that made it worthwhile finding the ant an ant friend to help carry the load. Greatest of apologies. Let's go back to Africa. It was in the fall of 2019 that Crystal Dawn booked a trip to Cameroon. She may have found the cost overwhelming had she researched all the costs up front, but she did not. She had a habit of leaping based on faith and not fact. The flight was affordable and made possible by a baby bear taxidermy mount for a trapper that had found it in the snow walking his line. It was an epic piece that paid for the flight. Then the cost of a visa, for Cameroon was a country that required special permission to travel to. Paul had to get a letter of permission from their police for Crystal to be able to enter the country. She really wanted to tour the fur tanneries in Douala, but to pre-arrange such meetings meant she was trying to conduct business and must be mentioned. To avoid such headaches, she never got to see the tanneries, but would do so one day in an effort to help them reduce pollution caused by tanning agents used in the chemical processes of tanning leather. Ah, yes, that's right. Crystal Dawn is a humanitarian, environmentalist, animal rights activist that at that time had been working as the first female flesher in the Okanagan Valley of British Columbia, Canada. That's a title she holds proudly, as fleshing is the most advanced skill required in a tannery. This skill dates back to the beginning of time, as men used animal skins for a body covering for as long as we are aware. She was self-taught with most skills until others helped impart their wisdom along the way. Had it not been for a retired fire chief trapper in Prince George, she would not have understood what the old books were explaining about how to turn ears, noses, and toes. Some things were better shown in person. Her old boss at the tannery taught her a lot of commercial tanning tricks and the proper use of a fleshing machine. She began researching advanced tanning through the International School of Tanning Technology. She didn't actually take their amazing courses, but rather printed their curriculum and began researching each topic mentioned individually. This was how Crystal found out about tanneries in Africa and all around the world. She applied for a position with the Solidaridad Network to help be a liaison to encourage people the proper disposal of tanning wastes in tanneries. After all, she wasn't some environmental paper pusher. She was a tanner and taxidermist. How often do you hear of an environmentalist, animal rights activist that is also a tanner, wildlife trapper, taxidermist? She had a beautiful blend that could offer a middle ground of understanding and respect. Crystal Dawn never got to see the tanneries, but she did get to see and smell the streets of Douala, where the gutters filled with all sorts of nastiness, impeding the flow of water. This is why she needed to go to Africa. If Solidaridad said, "Okay, we need you in Ethiopia. Have you been before? Do you know of their circumstance?" she would need to say, "I have not been to Ethiopia, but I have been to Cameroon and know of their circumstance." From the moment Crystal stepped off the airplane, she was instantly filled with panic from the smell that filled her nostrils. Smoke. It was not the delightful campfire smoke she enjoyed, or the burned barrels of the farm. This was a terrifying smell that signaled immediate danger. Another passenger she had previously chatted with in Paris was a concrete engineer that traveled there frequently for consultation, reassured her there was no fire, and you get used to the smell. She never did. Not until the last day of her journey, when something momentous happened that changed the smell and stirred the senses. She was in Yaoundé, Karibi, Douala, and Massambo in her few weeks there. She was traveling with her partner, who was known as America, for he had a greater understanding of English than French. He could also speak Pidgin, his mother's tongue, Douala, and his father's tongue, something with a B, she thought. Clearly a very intelligent man. He had trained as a computer programmer and dreamed of building a map app so that people could traverse the city, as not all streets had names or numbers. Imagine trying to find a business with no address. He was trying to help his people. I lost myself here, hang on. Sorry. Trying to help his people through new digital technologies. Crystal Dawn still had her outdoors Okanagan dream festering in her mind, needing completion, and Paul offered to help. Although a completely common pearl, her presence was greatly felt by others and was most definitely memorable. Crystal Dawn represented Canadians quite well. When the maid was dismissed for stealing her money, Crystal stepped up and helped wash floors and do laundry. Despite having done laundry by hand in her trailer's bathtub previously, she learned she was absolutely terrible at it. And it was for a fact that the people she encountered cared more for clean, beautiful white clothes than she did. She rolled in the red dirt and was almost always covered in a red haze, which was good because for a Canadian in January, she was as white as she could ever be. Men constantly shouted out, "Femme blanche!" It was odd because in Canada, if you yelled out, "Hey, black man," you could be charged if the person saw fit to persecute you to the fullest extent of the law. Yet here, it was so common, it became like a nickname for her. She didn't take offense. Only once did Paul react strongly to what someone had said to him about her. Strongly enough to indicate a fight would occur. Paul really stood up for himself and others in the community. He lived in an area that was difficult to drive cars into due to the condition of the roads. They were so roughly pitted out, it was near impossible to drive through. Yet some drivers were willing to risk their cars for a higher rate of pay. Most traveled by way of a motorcycle taxi. Those guys would remember Crystal. It was uncommon for passengers to hold on to the driver, but rather sat back holding the sides of their seat with no helmets and no seatbelt in cars. One time, she saw a woman with her children catching a ride on a motorcycle. One child was placed in front of the driver with his arms around the child, operating the bike. Behind him was another child, squished between the man's back and his mother's chest. While most North Americans forget their seatbelts or complain of the need for helmets with disdain, here was a population of people that didn't even have the choice to be safe and protect their lives and the lives of their children. Crystal was 100% positive it was impossible for her to cross a road in Yaoundé by herself without dying. Traffic, driving, transport, that whole area of necessity for a civil society to flourish was a complete safety nightmare. She feared for the life of every individual that ever needed to go near a road. There was always corruption in the process of applying for a driver's license, where money and then more money would eventually free up a license for an individual. It was not based on driving ability, though, although the reality of driving Yaoundé was not something that could be taught. If it was, the lessons would be, go when you can, stop before you hit someone, then go when you can. Whenever, wherever, if you see an opening, you take it. When she traveled in Caribbean, an incident occurred that sent a shock wave through the whole city. They had been on the exact spot hours prior to the event. A large logging truck was driving through the city, and the logs loosened and crashed across the road. At least one woman died in Crystal's recollection. Yes, it was her birthday on January 26th, because they were on the ocean front with a Rasta man that owned a decrepit hotel he was fixing. That day a man came and joined them with great sadness in his heart. His family had died in the accident. Despite Crystal being from the only other French-English bilingual country in the world, she couldn't speak French. She knew the basic words to describe things, but it was not enough to hold a conversation. Also, Crystal typically spoke at lightning speeds, so it made it difficult for English-speaking Africans to follow. Her experiences were mostly from how the situations felt. When she was in the fish supermarket on her birthday, a woman was making her some fresh prawns. There was a baby sleeping as she cooked, and it stirred and cried. Crystal was given the baby to soothe and cuddle while her food was being made. It was the best experience ever, as she realized she could have stolen this woman's baby. That might sound odd, so let's rephrase that by saying Crystal had been entrusted with the extended life force of another individual. That was truly a most wonderful sign of trust and love. There were only a few moments where Crystal had truly felt fearful, and it was always in the presence of the police or some uniformed official. When traveling from one region to another by bus, all passengers must have an ID and be prepared for stops along the way where they check IDs. It was here that the paroles were harassed, had their IDs held in return for payment, and barred travel. This happened several times on the journey, but one time was different. Paul was shouting at the man. He didn't have time to translate often while in the middle of speaking with someone, so Crystal was left confused as to what was occurring. Here we go. This time, the man wanted them both to exit the bus at night. Paul refused, as he had shown the IDs and there was no just cause. He told her later that was how they got people. They had to separate themselves from others, as extortion in public was dangerous because the people would rise up against them if pushed too far for an unjust cause. In the village of Massambo, his family owned a plantation. Palm trees and banana trees were the main crops. His family traveled between Yaoundé, Douala, and Massambo regularly to attend to matters at the plantation and court. They had once entrusted a man to watch their home in the village. When they returned, they learned he had sold all their furniture, pocketed the money, and disappeared. A lawyer in Douala was handling a long-distance dispute over the plantation they owned in Massambo. When they originally divvied up the land into parcels, special trees were planted that grew high above the rest. You could stand in the jungle and see the corners of your property by locating these massive trees. We're talking dinosaur big. A famous football player had laid claim to their plantation and had a rich father backing him to legally sway the courts to steal this land from its rightful owners that farmed the land and give it to the football player. The courts were corrupt, but they did not give up. It was a regular occurrence to travel for court dates by bus. Aside from the legal battle, there was another problem felt more locally, that the people of the village were divided as to whose side of the dispute they were on. Some preferred the football player and the money he brought to the village. Some loved the original owners that had deep ties and friendships with the elders of the community. There was one woman in her 80s, cheerfully clearing the brush off her land in the jungle. Amazing people. A small creek came through the village that connected to a larger river with some larger predators Crystal didn't want to encounter, so she kept to the smaller creek. Although the travel agent had made it sound as though Crystal should not interact with the environment at all, she connected with Africa in every way possible. She swam and bathed in the creek. She also stepped on a broken iron cable in the creek, which left metal in her foot and became the sole excuse for not wanting to wear shoes. It was easy to skip barefoot on the red, dusty paths of roads, villages, and cities. However, the jungle was a different story. There were many pokey plants in the jungle that caused one's feet to beg for shoes. The vines were amazing and not at all what Tarzan had made them out to be. The people. The people of the village were curious about this femme blanc skipping about, and one evening began to gather outside the family home at dinner. Crystal hadn't even noticed the group forming outside the window. His father approached the window and told Paul to take Crystal away from view and hide her. She was placed in a room as the family dealt with the situation brewing outside. She was told they were fearful the villagers may cause an issue. There were a lot of rising tensions, and her presence could cause a feud. After legal issues were handled in Douala, they were back on a bus to Yaoundé. She loved the bus rides. They were hot and crowded with no option for a bathroom. Can you imagine trying to hold it until the next planned stop? It was not easy. She sang her entire mental album of Simon & Garfunkel out loud. It was epic. Back in Yaoundé, she toured the zoo and met friends, family, neighbors, business owners, and anyone that would smile in exchange. She climbed trees and skipped down roads. Her new mother-in-law and sisters even braided her hair. It was gorgeous. On the last day of her time in Africa, something happened. In Africa, the seasons were different than in North America. It is either hot or rainy. It had been hot and muggy throughout the entire trip to the point of not being able to wear makeup, as it would just sweat off. On the last day, they traveled to visit a concrete artist. He had a business of finishing the exterior of buildings and fences in such a way it looked like carved natural wood. Crystal learned a lot of concrete work. As it turned out, they didn't plan ahead for the weather. Rain or sun, they poured the concrete and did the work required of them. She was no expert, but knew the temperature of concrete curing affected the result, so she found it rather silly there was no planning around the weather. Regardless, it was the dry season. It would not rain. After a wonderful visit, they parted ways. Exiting the building, the sky was not yet visible, yet the world felt completely different. It was as though a whole new energy filled the air. It was as shocking as the smell of smoke in one's nose upon first smelling Africa. As they walked further into the street, the buildings opened, revealing a darkened sky. It was going to rain. She felt it. Within the next 5 to 10 minutes, storm clouds rolled in that began a rainstorm that felt like a monsoon. Crystal was supposed to be flying home that evening, so Paul left her at the house to fetch a car. She spent the last few hours dancing in the rain. The ride arrived what could be perceived as late, but they had an hour to travel to the airport. The roads were full of vehicles, and traffic moved so slowly from the storm. It was feared they would not arrive in time. There was very little communication between Crystal and Paul and his parents, who had joined to drop her off. He wore her winter camouflage jacket as they drove. She needed it, as it was now February when she would return back in Canada. News of COVID and potential travel lockdowns were imminent. The taxi arrived at such a time that they ran into the airport to get in the line. She was a little late for their security clearing time, but had not missed the flight. She was taken to an office where a kind-faced woman gave her no answers as to what would happen with her flight. Could she catch it? Could she rebook? Her family was waiting at both airports for her to drop her off and pick her up. She needed to tell the news. A security man was consulted and gave no answers Crystal could understand. Crystal saw Paul waving to her from across the gate, so she requested he be present to translate because she could not understand what was being spoken. He was permitted access, and after many, many words, he said she could go. She gave quick goodbye hugs and threw on her jacket for the trip that lay before her on the journey home. She asked later what had happened in the airport, and he told her the guard was trying to extort money from her, but she was too naive to know it. Apparently, most people in that situation would have offered money to make the flight happen. Rather, Paul had shouted publicly across the airport that this man was corrupt. That was Paul, standing up for what was right. Their romance ended